Sometimes it's not the newest weapons that Ukraine needs to battle against Vladimir Putin's invading soldiers. As great as Patriot air defense systems and Storm Shadow missiles may be for Ukraine, the country also needs good old-fashioned firepower. Rockets, shells and howitzers can destroy Russian troop positions and equipment, no matter how old they are, and Ukraine is more than aware of that fact. That's why Ukraine will be delighted by what Greece just did. Greece has just delivered a vicious slap to Putin's face by sending Ukraine firepower that it can use to break Russia. On October 6th, the Kyiv Post reported that Greece is going to be sending a host of weapons that Ukraine can use to conduct strikes against Russian forces on the front lines. This isn't a donation, the outlet says. Rather, Greece is going to be using the Czech Republic as a sort of intermediary, as it will sell the weapons to the Czechs, who will then pass them on to Ukraine. More details about the nature of the deal will come later in the video. But first, the most important topic. What will Ukraine be receiving from Greece? First up are 60 203mm caliber M110A2 self-propelled howitzers. These are far from the most modern howitzers in the world. Army recognition says that the original version of this artillery unit, named simply the M110, was introduced into the US military way back in 1963. A typical M110 frame is made out of sheer steel, the outlet says, and requires a pilot who operates inside an armored cockpit. That pilot is part of a crew of between 5 and 8 people, depending on the M110 variant. And the howitzer has proven effective enough that several countries have used it in the 60+ years that it's existed. Beyond the US, M110s have been purchased by many countries that include Germany, Iran, Israel, Pakistan, the UK, and of course Greece. This is, or at least was, a very popular howitzer. That's great for Ukraine because it means there are still plenty of M110s lying around that could be donated to Ukraine, along with more than enough of the ammunition Ukraine needs to make the best possible use of this aging artillery system. The Kyiv Post says that Ukraine already has the perfect use for this sort of howitzer. The outlet describes the M110A1, which is an earlier variant of the M110, but is very similar to the M110A2s that Ukraine is about to receive, as a slow-firing howitzer that's capable of hitting targets at a range of more than 40 kilometers or around 24.8 miles. While this means that Ukraine could conceivably use the howitzer as an assault unit against Russian forces stationed in occupied territory, that likely isn't how Ukraine will use these weapons. Modern first-person view or FPV drones can serve that function over larger distances and with more precision, the Kyiv Post says. However, these older howitzers are ideal for offering Ukraine counter-battery fire. In other words, the M110 gives Ukraine artillery units that it can use to fight fire with fire. When Russia deploys its artillery as part of its assaults against Ukraine's defenders, M110s can fire on that artillery to take it out of the equation. The fact that M110s are mounted onto wheeled chassis is also a bonus. That means the howitzers can be moved to whatever position they need to be the most effective. Granted, that movement isn't always easy. The Kyiv Post notes that the M110A2 weighs over 28 tons, so driving it to a new location can be a fairly slow process. However, Ukraine can go from positioning to firing against Russia quickly. Once the howitzer is where it needs to be, a skilled crew can set up, fire, and then start moving to a new location in about 10 minutes. Of course, 60 howitzers won't be much use without ammunition. Greece has that covered too. It's going to provide 150,000 shells and firing charges along with the 60 howitzers, which gives each of Ukraine's M110A2s about 2,500 shells to work with. That isn't a huge number of shells in the context of the Ukraine war. In February, Forbes reported that Ukraine was firing about 5,155mm shells at Russia every day, creating an annual total of about 2 million shells. So, Greece has provided about a month's supply of shells for the howitzers it's selling to Ukraine. Plus, there's plenty of variety within these 150,000 shells, though more details on that will come later in the video. That's a starting point, and Ukraine should be able to use shells that it already has in its stockpiles to boost the longevity of the Greek howitzers. There isn't much more to say about the shells, so onto the third part of the Greek package. ZUNI rockets. Greece is going to be transferring thousands of these rockets in both their 2.75 and 5-inch varieties, the Kyiv Post reports. The exact number that thousands referred to isn't specified, but it should at least be enough to enable Ukraine to conduct more strikes with its aerial assets. Ukraine has already adapted many of its Soviet-era aircraft, including several of its fleet of Su-25s, to fire these rockets. The rockets will most likely be used by Ukraine to contain Russian forces in frontline sectors, the Kyiv Post says, while also noting that Ukrainian Air Force pilots have said that these rockets are both reliable and useful based on their usage up to this point. Additional information about the 5-inch version of the ZUNI is available thanks to Odin. It says that the ZUNI is a folding fin unguided aircraft rocket that was approved for production in 1957. The rockets have seen use in several conflicts, including the Korean War, and they can be very effective when used appropriately. The rockets have an operational range of about 8 kilometers, which is roughly equivalent to 4.97 miles, and they can hit speeds of up to 2,599 kilometers per hour. That's about twice the speed of sound, meaning the rockets fly with enough speed to make them tricky for Russian air defenses to handle. The ZUNIs aren't impossible to shoot down, but no Russian unit is going to want to deal with them at a time when Russia has already lost 1,225 of its anti-aircraft warfare units since the beginning of Putin's invasion, per Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. Popular Mechanics adds that Ukraine has already used a pretty substantial number of ZUNIs to hurt Russia. All 6,000 of these rockets that the US has in its stockpiles were donated to Ukraine soon after Putin invaded. Ukraine managed to jerry-rig the LAU-10 launchers the rockets need onto its Su-25s, along with its Mi-24 helicopters, and had burned through this stockpile of 6,000 rockets by June 2024. That demonstrates one thing clearly. Ukraine finds these rockets very effective. Having thousands more at its disposal thanks to Greece can only be a good thing for Ukraine, especially in 2025, when its aerial power has been bolstered by the arrival of F-16s and Mirage 2000s. Now, back to something mentioned near the beginning of this video, the structure of the deal. And deal is the appropriate word because Greece isn't donating its howitzers, shells and rockets to Ukraine. Rather, it's selling them to a nation that's going to ensure that these Greek munitions get to Ukraine. It's here where the Czech Republic comes into play. According to the Kyiv Post, the idea for creating this deal was likely formed in September. That's when Greece's general staff decided to downgrade the howitzers it's now sending to Ukraine to the non-operationally necessary equipment status. In simpler terms, that phrase means that Greece doesn't need its M110A2s anymore. Once the howitzers were given that status, Greece freed itself up to ink a deal with anybody who might want to purchase the weapons, though it didn't seem to want to sell them directly to Ukraine. So Greece instead settled on selling to the Czech Republic, with both sides acknowledging that the weapons Greece was selling might then be transferred to Ukraine. There's an element of plausible deniability that's providing direct aid to Ukraine that Greece seems to want to maintain here. The reason that element exists will be explained later in the video. Under the terms of the new deal, Greece values its howitzers at around $36.4 million. Interestingly, the 60 howitzers are worth less than the shells that Greece has also agreed to sell. And it's here where the earlier mention of the variety that's seen in those shells become relevant. Among the shells that Greece is selling to the Czech Republic are 50,000 M106 high explosive shells. Those are valued at around $48.3 million, giving them a per unit price of $966. These are standard shells, at least in M110A2 terms, but they're not the only shells that Greece is going to sell to the Czech Republic. It's also going to sell about $38.4 million worth of ICM improved shells, the Kyiv Post reports. The Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment says that these types of shells employ small bomblets that allow the user to blanket an area with small explosions rather than one large explosion. ICM improved shells are useful for dispersing troop formations and attacking elusive equipment, such as mobile artillery and air defense units, the outlet says. Greece is also going to sell 30,000 DPICM scatter mine shells to the Czech Republic for about $39 million. As the name implies, these types of shells scatter small mines around a target area, which makes them ideal for setting up ambushes or putting advancing troops in a position where they have to slow their assaults to navigate what amounts to an impromptu minefield set up around them. Exact numbers for the ZUNI rockets aren't yet available, which means it's hard to specify what their sale adds to the price of the howitzers and shells. Militani estimates that the total value of the package is more than $231 million, which suggests that Greece is going to be selling $68.8 million worth of its air-to-ground rockets. Popular Mechanics says that a single ZUNI cost around $400. If Militani's figures are accurate, that means the vague mention of thousands of ZUNI rockets translates to 172,000 rockets. That seems steep. The odds are that it's substantially less than that. It's possible that Popular Mechanics' $400 figure is the old cost of producing ZUNIs, meaning it may not take inflation or the amount added to the cost of the rocket for overseas customers into account. Still, these are the estimates available so far. More information will become available once the Greek weapons arrive in Ukraine. There are also some caveats that need to be overcome before this deal goes through. The Kyiv Post says that Ukrainian media have already confirmed the details of the deal, but it doesn't mention whether or not Ukraine's military has confirmed that it will be receiving these weapons. Similarly, the sale is still in the pre-approval stage in Greece. The country's National Security Council has to approve the particulars of the sale, with its decision likely to come following a meeting that's been scheduled for some point during the next few weeks, the Kyiv Post reports. Greece also isn't going to do any maintenance on any of these old weapons before they're sold to the Czech Republic and eventually passed on to Ukraine. Everything is being sold as is, meaning some of the howitzers and munitions Ukraine is about to receive aren't operational. Still, Ukraine won't mind. Fixing old weapons is something that its military is very capable of doing, and it would likely find uses for the Greek shells even if the howitzers aren't in the best condition. Earlier in the video, it was mentioned that Greece is going through the circuitous route of selling to the Czech Republic rather than Ukraine itself for a reason. That reason becomes clear when looking into another piece of equipment that many in NATO want Greece to deliver to Ukraine: Mirage 2005 fighter jets. 25 of them to be exact, which NATO, the US and the European Union or EU have been pressuring Greece to donate to Ukraine since the beginning of October. The Defense Post published an October 6 report on this situation, noting that NATO believes that the transfer of these fighter jets would help to reinforce Ukraine's air defense stockpiles. The 25 Mirage 2000s could be transferred to Ukraine because Greece's maintenance contract for the jets, which it signed with France, runs out in 2027. Plus, Greece has already purchased 24 Rafales and is currently negotiating for 12 more, meaning its Mirage jets will soon be surplus to requirements. Indeed, the Greek Air Force is in the process of decommissioning these jets, according to the Kyiv Post. The proposed deal would be structured much like the one seen with the Czech Republic, the Defense Post says. An intermediary, such as France or Germany, would buy the jets from Greece and then transfer them to Ukraine. However, Greece is far less comfortable with this deal than it is with the one it's on the verge of doing with the Czech Republic for a simple reason. Greece doesn't want to provide advanced weapons to Ukraine. That's according to Euractiv, which points out that all Greek donations and sales to Ukraine so far have been of less advanced weapons. Greece has provided missiles, rifles and armoured vehicles to Ukraine, and it's even contributed to the training of Ukraine's F-16 pilots. But when it comes to delivering advanced weapons to Ukraine, such as the Mirage fighter jets, Greece balks because it's still very wary of angering Putin. The Greek media outlet Ekathimerini sums up the Greek mood when covering the pressure the country is under from its NATO and EU allies. It says that Greece going ahead with a deal for its Mirage 2000 is doubtful. However, Greece may end up being left with no other options if it wants to make any money from its old fighter jets. Discussions with India to sell them hit an impasse, and there were no takers from other Balkan countries either, Ekathimerini reports. Eventually, Greece is going to have to make a decision on these jets. Does it choose not to sell? In that case, Greece loses out on a chance to make some of its money back from its Mirages, but it also keeps itself off Russia's radar by remaining one of the EU nations that hasn't provided high-tech weapons to Ukraine, even indirectly. Or does Greece bite the bullet and sell the Mirages to a country that will provide them to Ukraine? That will anger Putin, sure. However, it may also come with the benefit of bringing Greece closer to its NATO and EU allies. For now, what happens with Greece's Mirage fighter jets is a question that will be answered another day. Coming back to now, Ukraine is on the verge of receiving howitzers, shells and rockets thanks to the deal between Greece and the Czech Republic, and all of these weapons will prove useful to Ukraine. For a start, Ukraine can always use more howitzers, even if the weapons it's receiving are several decades old. Peter Pomerantsev, writing for The Guardian in December 2024, made that point in an opinion piece where he claimed that it was time for Ukraine's European family to start providing more hardware and fewer cozy words to Ukraine. Pomerantsev makes the point that one of Russia's strategies is to use its own artillery to kill its way to victory in Ukraine. The Greek M110A2s have already been discussed as a means for Ukraine to counter this particular strategy, which is why more of any type of howitzer is always going to be better for Ukraine than none at all. Ukraine itself realizes how important the artillery battle is. In August, technology.org noted that Ukraine's growing defense sector has already gotten to the point where the country is producing more artillery systems than the rest of Europe every year. Chief among these domestically manufactured systems is the 2S-22 Bodana. As of October 7, Ukraine is at the point where it's manufacturing 40 of these howitzers monthly. The addition of Greece's old howitzers is essentially a solid addition to an ever-growing pile of artillery that Ukraine needs to cut down Russia's artillery advantage in the war. Ukraine is already well on its way to cutting down that advantage. In April, the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, said that Ukraine had cut Russia's artillery advantage in half, using long-range strikes that target Russia's artillery manufacturers and shell stockpiles. Where Russia once fired 40,000 shells daily at Ukraine, it was down to 23,000 per day by April. A great way to build on this good work would be to have more howitzers in Ukraine to counter those that Russia deploys. The Greek M110A2s fulfill that role, just like the artillery that Ukraine is making for itself. As for the ZUNI rockets, they increase Ukraine's aerial power. Granted, these aren't high-tech missiles or even precision-guided bombs. However, as discussed earlier, Ukraine is very familiar with this type of rocket, and it's used them to do damage to Russia's forces many times in the past. One example comes from October 2024, which is when Militani reported that a Ukrainian Su-25 scored direct hits on a Russian building housing soldiers. The outlet notes that Ukraine's Air Force can use these types of rockets both to support Ukraine's ground forces and to shell Russian defensive positions. Zoomies aren't accurate, Militani says, and they have a low probability of hitting a target directly, but they can serve almost as a form of aerial artillery, which means they could prove useful when Ukraine launches counter-offensives against Russian troops in occupied territory. This situation gives Ukraine an opportunity to turn old weapons into lethal assets against Russia's forces, all thanks to Greece. Russia has a track record of trying to use older assets against Ukraine too, only that isn't going very well for Putin. Russia is deploying rotting Soviet armor, not because it's useful, but due to Ukraine having obliterated everything else. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the latest weapons that Ukraine adds to its arsenal.